call the roll. Mr. Convertito is not able to make it. Mrs. Kennelly may be late. Mr. Liu is here. Mrs. Gerber is here. Philip Dwyer is here. We are expecting Mrs. Iacono at some point. Mr. Fatabeen is here. Mr. Kerry is not able to make it tonight, and Mrs. Brand. If I could have you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The primary issue that we're dealing with, or presentation, if you will, is the report from Woodard and Curran on all of our buildings. And so I'll have Dr. Teitel introduce that presentation, and if the two speakers come up to the table, feel free to grab a microphone.
Right, thank you. This is a follow-up from earlier work that we contracted with Woodard and Curran to do on giving us kind of a map as to how we should go about dealing with the potential issue of PCBs in all of our schools after the Osborne Hill situation. So they did some initial work for us, and they've done some follow-up work for us. And so I'm going to have Jeff Hamill and Lisa Camp take over from here and explain exactly what they did and what it means. You all got the report. It's on the website. It's fascinating reading. And I want to thank them for the thoroughness with which they did it. I know that some of it, if you read it cover to cover, feels a little repetitive, but I think that was intentional because that way any one school has the full narrative in there, so you don't have to flip back and forth. So so I want to thank them for doing that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Lisa, and we'll just ask you to keep the mic real close to you because it's a very sensitive sound system. So thank you for coming back.
Thank you, Dr. Teitel. Good evening. So we'll just give a brief presentation on the report, and then we can answer any questions that there may be. So if you remember from our goal of the survey was to develop a management program for PCBs and building materials that was similar to other hazardous constituents that are in buildings, like asbestos or lead-based paint. And so to bring the PCBs in line with those other things that are done. And the essence of those management programs that have been around for a long time are really if a material is intact or inaccessible, it's managed in place until the time when there's a renovation or a disturbance, and then it's managed appropriately. So that was our goal to try to come up with. And the first step in that process was to collect some information that would help us determine the potential presence of PCBs in building materials, or what was suspect and what could be, because you can't do it from a visual indicator. You just can't go out and look at something. Sealants and caulking is the predominant building material that has PCBs. If you go on EPA's webpage, that's what it's called, PCBs and caulking in school buildings. And you can't tell the difference from caulking that you put on today versus 1960. It all looks the same. So we had a series of, I guess, filters or funnel steps to help us understand what might be out there. And I'm just going to walk through them briefly so there's an understanding of how we started from 16 school buildings to where we got to with the survey report. And so we started with 16 buildings, and the first filter or funnel is construction date. So if PCBs had a limited time frame of use, and basically from the late to mid-70s they were banned, so any building that was constructed post-1980 can't have PCBs. So that brought the number of buildings from 16 down to 13, because there were 3 schools that were built post-1980. And it also helped us look at the floor plans of the buildings to see if there were additions or portable classrooms or other things of that nature that were post-1980, and therefore those materials constructed in that building wouldn't have PCBs either. So we helped narrow the field of what we were looking at. The second filter or funnel was associated with existing data. So if there was a recent window replacement project, which was done on several of the elementary schools, those new windows with that new caulking that would look like other sealants around it would be excluded because it was recently put in and it was PCBs are banned and they're not in that material. So you wouldn't look at those windows. As well as looking some of the existing data, there have been some schools that have gone through renovations in accordance with the district's management program that they have. They tested for various substances, asbestos and PCBs, and then they have that data point whether it was positive or detected PCBs. So we use that data as well. The third filter was the building surveys, the initial building surveys, which we did in January and February of this year. And we used a indicator screening method. And I think we've talked about this last time, where we use chlorine as an indicator. It's a machine that we can do hundreds of tests just instantaneously, so you can get a lot of data points quickly, and then you can use that information. So the theory behind chlorine is that you have PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, so it has chlorine in it. So if you screen something and it doesn't have chlorine or a high concentration of chlorine, you can start making some correlations that there might not be PCBs in that material because there's no chlorine. If you don't have chlorine, you can't have a PCB. So it's a good screening indicator. So we've been using that as a firm for multiple buildings, multiple sites, and we have a database on these renovation projects where they get to a point where after you've done some initial evaluation, you have to sample for disposal purposes. So we can take that sample and then compare it to what the chlorine was. So we have over 300 plus samples, and we can plot chlorine concentration to PCB concentration, and then that helps us understand what would a correlation factor be for if I screen and I don't have the bulk data, where would that fall in my realm. And those are some of the charts that we put in that first report that we sent out in April. And the results from that was the majority of the samples that we've collected, which were about 355 screening samples during the initial survey, were below this kind of indicator threshold that we have from our database where we have good one-on-one correlations. And now the specific percentages were 82% of the samples from the inside and 64% of the samples from the outside fell in this range where you wouldn't expect to see regulated concentrations of PCBs. So we thought that was good news for the bulk of the sealants being collected, but there were some that had chlorine concentrations over that threshold, not a lot of samples. But we wanted to go back and look at those as part of our next level of filtering, which was this most recent follow-up survey that we did over the summer, where we went back out to the buildings to take a look at the areas that were above that indicator threshold for chlorine. So you start with 16 buildings, you move it down to 13, you move it down to the areas that were pre-1980, and then you screen a lot, and then you look at the areas that just had elevated screening to kind of help us understand the potential for PCB presence. So when you look at all the different schools and all the areas that were identified, even though the majority of the samples were below that, there were about 70 areas that we wanted to go back and look at to see what was in there, how did it look like from a visual observation. And the two main points of information that we were looking at, if you go back to the original goal of what do you do in a management program, is if it's intact and inaccessible, then you manage it in place and you wait to a renovation project to have it disturbed. So we went back and looked at those two things. So we went back in those areas that had high chlorine and said, is this sealant or caulking or material intact? Is it accessible? Is it covered up by something? And we came up with two criteria, low or medium. And the low was that it was covered up already, and a good, with some other coating. And a good example of that is on the inside of a school. You can imagine a door with CMU or concrete block walls, and around that door frame, there'd be sealant, but all the walls are painted. They paint right over that sealant, so it's all covered up. So, someone in the building, can't touch the actual caulking. It's covered with a new coating, like an encapsulation, so to say, over that coating. So if it was covered by a coating, or if it was inaccessible, and some inaccessible are second floor windows on the outside, no one can really touch that aspect of it, or a restricted access on an exterior wall near a loading dock or something like that would be inaccessible. On the medium category was anything else. So if it wasn't covered by another coating, or somebody could come up and touch that sealant, then we would say that would be the medium category. So we went through that, and of those areas that went through the filter for the chlorine, 66% of those areas were in the low category. So even though it had high chlorine, it still was covered by some other coating or was inaccessible from a direct contact point, which was another good point of the survey. But we still had the 24% of the areas that were sealants that had high chlorine that weren't covered by a coating or could be accessible. And it ended up being 20 areas distributed around the schools, 1 or 2 around the schools. And the recommendation was to put a coating on those, just cover them up, encapsulate them up so they wouldn't be direct contact, and be similar to the other ones. And that's what the district has decided to do as a maintenance program, to get out there. Those areas are all identified on the maps in the drawing, and they're going to go out and either re-caulk them or put some paint over it or cover them up. So we would get to a position where all the sealants or all the suspect materials are now in this position where they're either intact or inaccessible, which is what the goal was at the beginning for the management program, to try to have something that was suspect to be in a place where it was either inaccessible for touching or covered up or with some kind of coating and being intact. So that was the findings, or that was the survey, and then the kind of recommendations were to follow some best practices that the Connecticut DEP and the EPA has out for schools, conduct this kind of interim measure or near-term kind of coating to get everyone to the same state, conduct periodic inspections to make sure that those coatings are maintained, and if they're not, to cover them back up. And then when a project comes in, either it's a window replacement project or some other renovation where that material is going to be removed, then just like all the other potential hazardous constituents in a building, whether it's asbestos or lead-based paint or now PCBs, the appropriate firm kind of goes in, does the testing that needs to be done, and then they develop abatement plans if needed for the proper disposal of the material. I think that's where we're at right now.
Ms. Camp, do you have anything you want to add before we go to questions?
No, I mean, I think, we took what I think is a practical but technically based approach, and like Jeff said, we were really looking at, I think, one of the first meetings I talked about that it's really about the exposure potential. And so by looking at the condition of the material, very similar to what you look at with asbestos, if something's intact and in good physical condition and you don't see debris or particulates coming off, plus it's either encased in something or so high or on the outside of a building that it's not accessible for contact, you're really minimizing the potential for exposure and hence, any kind of risk. So I think, Jeff outlined a very pragmatic but logical and, approach for really winnowing down the universe of materials that maybe need some interim measures, and it's a pretty small universe. So I think, just stepping back from my perspective, it's kind of, a nice outcome, because you started with 16 schools and not really having your arms around it, and you've really narrowed it down to, a few materials in a few areas in schools that seem like it can be, easily managed. So.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the board? Mrs. Gerber, followed by Mrs. Brand.
Hi, thanks. I had a question about Dwight, because that is the only school, I believe, that has the fireproofing in the roof in the gym. And just because obviously that's the issue with Osborne Hill, with the the gym as we know. And I know you have this one thing here with the % chlorine, and it's slightly higher at Dwight than it is at Osborne Hill, and I understand that there are other factors at play there, so that doesn't necessarily mean. But I know that you're saying that moving forward, we're supposed to, if they are out of sight, or if they are, encapsulated, if we don't have to touch them or do anything with them, disturb them, then it'll be okay. But I think with Osborne Hill, when they started to become friable, I guess, is it a kind of thing, would you recommend me moving forward? Do you have to do kind of like a yearly check to make sure, because the numbers were so high at Osborne Hill when we did become aware of it? So just now, is there some way to kind of make sure that we don't end up with those numbers, that we can kind of stay ahead of it? I mean, I'm assuming the answer is yes, since we already have all of this information that we didn't have. But I just was interested to get your thoughts on that, since that one kind of jumped out at me.
Absolutely. So we took a good look at that spray-on fireproof coating in the gymnasium because it was visually similar. And as I said in the beginning, visual is not always the greatest criteria to look at, because a lot of things look the same. And chlorine, even though it kind of helps on the negative aspect of it, like no chlorine, no PCBs, chlorine is very common in a lot of products. So you have a lot of chlorinated products. So when you have positive numbers, it's hard to say that, is it something else or is it PCB? So you really can't get any conclusions on it. So with those two data things for the spray-on coating, we went back and we looked at it, and there were some differences between the two gyms. And one of the bigger ones was a suspended ceiling underneath the beams on the top, on the spandrels, that Osborne didn't have. That was directly open underneath. And two, the material, when the second time out, we got a lift, went up there, popped open the ceiling, went up, looked at all the things, and got a really good inspection of it. And there wasn't little chunks of the coating falling on top of the panels or anything else like that. So it was pretty much intact. And my understanding, talking to others in Tom's department, is that at Osborne Hill, that wasn't the case. They had a lot of particulate matter, and they had some issues with the HVAC system and vents and filters, and trying to do that because there was a lot of dust in the air from, generating from that material, and that might have been the main contributor to the indoor air. So from a intactness and accessibility, it got ranked in the low, but that carries a periodic inspection. So you're absolutely right that that should go out, look at that, and if there's any signs that it's deteriorating or falling down or generating kind of dusty environment, or there's any change in maintenance records with the filters on the air exchange units or anything else like that, that should be noted and then taken care of as they go forward.
Yeah, please do.
Well, I guess the other thing, too, with Osborne Hill, the numbers were high in the air. And I guess as a result of the material kind of falling apart. But would there be concerns that even if there wasn't material falling apart, that there would be concerns about the air quality, or does one follow the other? So until we found, like, you checked in the ceiling and you did see a couple of little pieces coming out, then we'd be like, okay, now there might be a problem? Or would it have to happen like that, or would you be concerned that even without seeing it, there might be issues? Or does one follow the other, or are they independent of each other?
Well, I think one of the questions is, how do PCBs get in air? And they're heavy molecules, big molecules that are considered non-volatile. So unlike some volatile organics that are in gasoline or fuels that or cleaning solvents or things of that nature that readily volatilize, and if you open up something or if you pump your gas, you can smell them and things like that. PCBs are not like that. They tend to sorb, they tend to stay on the material, which is why some of it is a concern for EPA, because they don't go away, they don't volatilize, they're very persistent, but they stay in that material. So one of the drivers with PCBs in indoor air is particulates. So if something's flaking off, falling apart, it's in a suspended or it's a solid particle, that's the main driver where you have indoor air concentrations with PCBs. And that's what was seen at Osborne Hill primarily, is my understanding is a lot dustier. And in the gym at Dwight, it doesn't seem to be dusty at all in the gym itself as compared to Osborne. I don't know if you want to add any
Yeah, I mean,
with
and
volatilization.
I think the point Jeff made too about the air handling system. So you're right, you can't necessarily, like asbestos too, you can't necessarily see fibers in air. But, we have some very good visual indicators that it looks like a very low probability for any significant particulates to be introduced into the air. Plus the fact that it's not like, I guess at Osborne Hill, they had like 2 filtration systems, and they were accumulating dust on them. They could see it as part of the air return, and nothing like that has ever been noted at the Dwight School. So I think, you kind of really have the air system, observations, as well as the material condition and the fact that you also have the suspended ceiling. So those things together, I think, lead to a low probability. We obviously can't say 100%, that it's 0, but it seems like it would be a very low probability of a significant pathway.
Mrs. Brand?
Yes, thank you very much. I had a couple of questions. Do you folks also make a recommendation in terms of follow-up, in terms of tag on to actually what Mrs. Gerber is talking about, how we monitor that? For instance, we're talking about a ceiling that we think is intact, we don't have any particulates, the condition's good, but we need to, I would assume, annually inspect it to make sure that it is maintained that way. Do you have, as any company to this, any more recommendations for a inspection/maintenance schedule for us as well?
Yes, I think it should be that, I think we call it periodic, but talking to Sal is when they go in over the summer breaks and do their normal kind of maintenance of different activities, that would be added to the list of things, to get a lift, go up into the ceiling, and then make some inspections and some notes relative to the previous inspection to make sure it's still intact, nothing's falling off. And then I think a review of the air exchange system and that filter change out is another good indicator of particulates and dust that may be a changing condition from where it is now.
In addition to that, I was thinking along those same lines that we have a Tools for Schools program. If I, through the chair to the superintendent, could also request that the Tools for Schools receive a copy of this so that we're all, excuse the expression, on the same page in terms of our support and follow-up of this. The other thing, which actually has to do with you folks, please correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see our alternative high school on this list, and we are leasing it, but it is an older building. So I was wondering, perhaps, did you go through that building as well?
That was not included in the 16 buildings that we started with.
We
Okay.
used that, right?
I'm sorry? Through the chair to Dr. Tittle, that is an older building, certainly, and we are using it. Is it possible to have a review of that as well? I mean, clearly, it's
I think the issue there is that, we don't own that building,
right.
and so I think that would be something that the owner of the building would need to, be agreeable to, or, talk to us about, so we can look into that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. And the last piece is that this, I think, certainly is very valuable, but a lot of it has to do, certainly on our end, with the follow-through. So, again, I would hope that we would be including it, and I know I saw Tom nodding as a maintenance part, but also if we would give the copy of this document to any building committees, because they go through a lot of this work honestly, to do what you folks just did. If you can do some of the labor for them, it actually could have us some cost savings as well. Thank you.
Well, and just in terms of follow-up, in addition to the inspections that Jeff and Lisa are talking about, there's also some action recommendations in here.
Right, I saw.
And what we're doing now is, now that we have the report, we are giving this report to some vendors to get some pricing on what would the cost be to, fairly rapidly take care of the ones that are listed as medium, which are the ones that require caulking or painting or some sort of sealant. So now that we have the report, we're going to get that. We'll see what the price tag is. We'll see what we can do, in the current budget, what might need to be in next year's budget, what we might need to, that's another step we're going to take, because some of it is periodic inspection, but some of it is, we need to take action. We don't have a sense of the scope of the cost for that at this moment.
Yeah, because I'm wondering if you're talking operating or capital. I think that's what you're trying to decide here.
I think we need to seek, we've talked about that internally. It's really a question of what the price tag is going to look like.
Right.
I would say that this is just in my short time here, knowing what the town considers capital and what they consider maintenance, what they will bond and what they won't bond, my general sense would be is they will say, this is maintenance, we don't want to bond this, but we need further information before we can make that determination, and we can, let you know where we stand on that as we move along.
Mrs. Iacona.
Thank you. I think this question is more in line for administration. Based on the outcome of this report, will that cause you, as you're working on the long-range facilities plan that will come to the board in the spring, to possibly adjust projects? Or you think, based on the reporting here of immediate action items, things won't need to be bumped out? And not having a long-range plan in front of me, for instance,
Yeah.
do windows at a certain school, should those get bumped up ahead of somebody else?
We just haven't had time to think that all the way through. It's a lot to absorb, and literally, we got this when you got it, so obviously, we have a little time. One of the reasons that we waited on the long-range facilities plan revision was to get this report. We also need to get the report from the police department on security, and when we have both of those in place together, along with our new enrollment projections, when those three pieces come together, then I think we look at the whole package, and if we want to recommend changes in the long-range plan at that point, I think it has to be done as a, full, with all the full
Comprehensive.
information. Right now, this in and of itself, it's too new to really decide whether this
I have one of
should
those.
change the order or not. And ultimately, that would be the board's, decision in the spring when the plan comes forward.
So you'll review this with your team and then come
Correct.
back with a package of recommendations for
Right,
changes?
this along
to
with the other two pieces.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then my other question was specific to Riverfield and the fact that they're actively in the midst of a building project. And then one of the areas that came back as medium is the gymnasium, which is obviously going to undergo a lot of work. And then there's some caulking and stuff that needs to be done, and some interior windows that I know exactly which windows you're speaking of that need to be addressed. On this particular instance, will you be working then directly with the building committee to see which aspects of this will come up and can be addressed? And it might not make sense to do this medium thing on the gymnasium if that's going to be not existent in,
Right.
coming
And
this summer.
we have to look at that. There could be parts of the building that Jeff and Lisa have flagged as needing work that the building committee isn't really doing much.
Correct.
Right? There could be other parts of the building where the building committee is going to go in there, they get this recommendation, and they could just absorb it into their work. So we'll have to look at the specifics of each part of the building, because Riverfield is not a full,
Right.
Yeah.
I just hate to see us go in, spend a bunch of money, and then have us rip down a wall and have it be moot.
Exactly.
That's my only thing. Whereas like those windows for the library, I know they're not being touched, so that's something we would need to invest in.
right, so that's we need to look at what parts from their report dovetail with the parts that Riverfield is going to be doing.
Okay, so internally, we'll get that communication to the building committee. All right, thank you. Thank you for this report.
Other questions? Mr. Liu.
Thank you. The recommendations that you have after all of the reports are pretty much the same that they were based on the EPA recommendations. And those are things that you are asking us to follow through on. And I guess my question is, Dr. Title, how are we going to do that throughout the schools that we've actually studied?
How are we going to do what's in the report?
Yeah, all the
Yeah.
best management practices. I mean, it said not to use a broom in certain places. and-
Right. Right, and I think that we have to look at, and there's a lot of layers to this. So there are some things that, as Jeff and Lisa said, that we need to do sort of on an annual or semi-annual basis in terms of inspections. And, Tom and his crew will work on making sure that gets done in a timely manner. Then there's the parts where we need to probably hire a contractor to go in and do some actual work. Then I think the other elements are training issues for the staff. Right?
That's
Yes.
mostly my concern.
Yeah, and so, we need to look at those, and, again, having little time to react to this, I don't know whether this is a, heavy lift or a light lift, because it could be that some of those practices are already in place, it's not a change in practice. In other cases, it may be that we have to put out different instructions to the custodial staff about how to, do their work. So we'll work with the custodial supervisor and the custodial staff, and if there's a different way that we should be approaching cleaning of classrooms or furniture, then we'll have to build that into our plan for, instructing the custodial maintenance staff.
I just would like to also just say that possibly would you consider also talking to the teachers about this, given that they do small cleanups here and there, and it would be good for them to be aware of what they should or shouldn't be doing.
No, it makes sense.
Thank you.
Mr. Fattabine?
Yeah, I guess I have a quick question, I guess. The question is, my understanding of your analysis was it was based primarily on using chlorine as an indicator for the presence of PCBs. Did you do any testing that would directly identify the presence of PCBs?
No, we did not collect any bulk samples for lab analysis for PCBs.
Okay.
Any other questions? I have a couple myself, but Mr. Liu?
A follow-up on that question. Why not?
So we came up with an approach to kind of do this filtering basis and to come up with a management program that would allow the proper abatement and management at that time of a renovation
Right.
or a disturbance or something like that. So the materials, if you think about these buildings, sealants are throughout the whole building, and like asbestos and lead-based paint and other things, and basically if they're there, the mere presence doesn't mean that they're a risk and need to be removed. So to know that they're present doesn't necessarily say that you need to know that and then remove that. What we're trying to do is say there's a lot of, if you think about the number of buildings that are built between 1950 and the late 1970s, aside from just schools, just buildings in general, there's a large universe of buildings that are out there that have these materials in them. So the program is not so much a let's go out and remove all these things, because we're not even sure if they're generating any kind of exposure potential or risk. It's more if to manage them appropriately. And similar to asbestos, PCBs are falling in that line where it says if it's intact and non-accessible, I can have it there. It's not creating a risk. But at the time that I want to remove it, I want to make sure that I have the right controls. So if I'm ripping out something, I'm not creating dust and having it cross-contaminate something else. And then when I take that, I'm not disposing of that in some place I can't take it. So I transfer the testing, so to say, to the project basis and not the kind of upfront assessment.
I just wonder if, because I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, we want to find a balance, and if some things are covered or they're not being actively agitated, they may be fine. But what about just doing a basic air quality test to see if, because like you said, you can't always see. And that does seem to be one of the aspects of this horrible thing, is that besides knowing where it is, sometimes it's in the air. Was that part of your, is that something that we should have asked of you, or do you necessarily recommend? It concerns me because I think that's one of the aspects that it's just an unknown. So what do we do? I mean, we're sort of guessing, I guess, right?
Well, no, I think we're taking a practical approach to manage materials. So,
Okay.
Lisa and I deal with contaminants all the time, and mainly we deal with contaminants that have been released, all right? So there's been a spill of something, and now you have to go clean it up. So it's active testing, managing, and cleaning up this release. The building material is different. It was made with it, and it's there. It's functioning in its intended use. It hasn't been released to the environment. So there's no regulation out there that says, go clean it up. It just says that if it's there, then when you're ready to encounter it, then you manage it appropriately. So when we went through the screening process and tried to come up with a logical framework, so to say, and it's not like this is done all the time. I mean, the district has been very proactive in trying to answer this question and coming up with this process. we can't go back and say that, yep, this is the way it's done, EPA does this. If you go to the website, it's not there, DEP says it's not there. What they basically say is, what we put in here, do best practices, and then when you're ready to remove it, handle it appropriately, but they don't require testing at any point.
Okay.
So we kind of just followed what was the standard practice in trying to come up with
And with Osborne Hill, is it because we did some construction, so we moved it? Is that how we got to figuring out that there was high levels of this? Or
It was the window project.
it was the window project?
Right.
So it was actually doing something that agitated it?
Correct.
I couldn't remember. All right.
So once you get into a project, then it kind of opens up the door.
Right.
Now you're really got to clean up whatever's there.
Got it.
Mrs.
All right.
Brand, to follow
Thank
up
you.
to that topic?
Yeah, my question is, I think earlier, if I remember correctly, you said that you would use chlorine because PCBs have chlorine in them. So I guess my question for you is, what's the differential between doing a testing specifically for PCBs, which, as I recall, you said was expensive, and the difference between doing a test just for chlorine and then a follow-up? So there's got to be a gap here, but what I don't appreciate is what the significance of the gap is. What percentage difference are we talking about? What level accuracy?
Well, again, that can just be analogous to other things that we do. So the use of screening techniques in our industry is common. So if you do like a gasoline release or something like that, we go with a field machine and we test all the soil, we test the air, we feel what's going on, we try to delineate, get an idea of what might have been released, and then we take a sample and go to the laboratory, because that is the ultimate decision maker for the regulation. So the regulation says if it's over this threshold, then you have to dispose of it in a certain place. So there's a pretty big gap, so to say, between screening and actual test data. But what we like to do in the upfront is use what we call like a weight of evidence type of approach, where we collect a bunch of information to help us get to a decision point. And at this decision point, it wasn't necessarily to determine if a material had a certain constituent. It was to determine that if something was suspect, is it intact and inaccessible, and can it enter into the management program? Because unlike a release area where it had to be cleaned up, this wasn't something that had to be cleaned up.
I just want to add one little thing. If we had seen something that had a very high chlorine scan and was in very bad condition and accessible, then there might have been a recommendation to sample. But like Jeff said, everything that was included in this was either low or medium. We didn't see anything that had sort of all three indicators flashing that this is such a high probability or high potential risk that we feel we need to take that analytical sample now. So I just want to put in perspective too, almost, like Jeff said, we went through like these funnels and we ended up with, what did you say, 20 types of materials in 20 areas in the schools that, we felt that an interim measure needed to be taken, but we didn't really see anything that sort of dinged on all the high exposure potential and bad condition and accessible and a high chlorine scan that made us feel we needed to recommend that next step at this point in time.
Quite frankly, I do appreciate your perspective was looking at it from what is probable, what is reasonable from a management perspective. But from my perspective, I understand, I'm not sure in your shoes I would do any different, but I'm not in your shoes, I'm in this one. So my question for you, again, quite frankly, is what's the differential? I haven't gotten an answer in terms of when you look at PCBs and when you do a PCP test, when you're doing just give me a frame, what's the difference?
Between screening and
Right,
a test?
yeah.
So we've, I can answer that a couple of different ways. So in all the projects that we do, we only test when we have a removal, because it's a disposal regulation. So the regulation says proper disposal, you need to know what that material is. So when we're evaluating things, it's always this weight of evidence, this kind of conceptual understanding of things, until that point is done where there's an actual removal and then there's a test. the differential between screening and testing, I can just go back to the amount of data that we've collected where we have 300-plus screening samples and then testing samples. So when we've looked at that and we plotted that up, and it's similar to the graphs that we shown in the first report, is that if it's below this threshold that we call, then there was a 95% chance that it would be below the regulatory criteria. So that's what we use as the differencing. So we've got 300 samples, and 95% of them, if it's below this level, it's below the regulatory threshold. If it's above that level, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's 60-40 because of all those other chlorinated compounds that are in materials. So it's not a good indicator of positive detection. We use it from a false, from a negative detection type of thing.
All right, thank you.
So we started with 300, we retested, we resampled, or whatever the phrase is, 70, and we came down to 20 that were mentioned medium. Following up on Mrs. Brand's comment, you didn't have any samples that you had high and therefore an immediate recommendation. But I take it from the comment that if there was such a sample that you discovered, you would have included in this report. This should be dealt with immediately. Can I assume that the median is, short-term means within the year, we ought to be having all of these items taken care of? Is that what you mean by short-term, the median?
I don't think we thought through a time frame to it. I think we called, I know we called it near-term.
Near-term.
So it's getting some information, what's a good cycle. Sometimes you have to work within the school calendar. When can you get in there? When can you get crews in to do different things? So it might be a subset of them get done one summer, and then the next summer. I think that would be reasonable for it. And the reason we don't have a high is because any of the building material is not super direct contact. And we're talking about sealants or sealing things that nobody's going around and touching all the time. High criteria are things of where you have a release where somebody's playing in dirt or something like that, and there was a release there. So there's a high potential for direct contact and things of that. With the building material, especially the caulking, you're looking at a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch bead around a door that just doesn't get touched a lot. So by default, they're always in that medium category.
Well, thank you for coming back. When the board got the original report and wanted some additional testing done, it's because we wanted to be proactive in terms of what the best management practices are. You've highlighted those for us, so we appreciate that, and it gives Tom just additional work to follow through on. Not that his plate is full enough already. There are no other questions or comments. We'll move on. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
For approval of the minutes, the recommended motion for enclosure number 2 is that the Board of Education approve the minutes of the regular meeting of September 10th, 2013. Do I have a motion? Mrs. Iacona? Do I have a second? Mrs. Gerber? Any discussion? All in favor, raise their hands and say yes, no, maybe. We have 4. Are you, and any negative? And 1 abstention. So Mrs. Gerber, Phil Dwyer, Mrs. Iacona, Mr. Fattabine, and Mrs. Brand vote in favor. Mr. Liu votes in abstention. Board committee reports. Are any that are required at the moment that haven't already been distributed? The minutes of Riverfield have been distributed? Seeing none, hearing none. The only question I would ask is, at what point do the students get organized and start attending?
That should be happening shortly. I'd expect that we'd have students here at the next meeting.
Okay, good. Superintendent's report.
Yeah, actually, I have 3 items. I have an item C on food service I want to address briefly on the food service RFP. You'll recall at the last meeting, we had a presentation on naming the alternative high school from Mr. Fitzgerald. Students were here, faculty were here, administration, Margaret Mary was here, and the board asked some really good questions, which was, the gist of which was, what exactly is the name going to be? And that sparked a lot of discussion among the board. The students were listening to it, the administration was listening to it, and it turns out to be a more complicated question than maybe they had thought, which is a good thing. And so they wanted more time to think about it. They want to have it brought to the student council. They want to vet several options and go through a process. And so they asked for a delay to the October meeting to come back with a specific name. So that's why it's not on the agenda. It's not that we forgot about it. It's just that they wanted to think it through a little more, which I thought was a good thing. So that's why that's not on the agenda. We expect it in October to have an official name for it.
Just one comment, and if you don't see it on the October meeting, it's because they're probably continuing to discuss it.
No, we're going to force a decision, I think, on this one. You may not like it, in which case it would get pushed off, but I think they will have, we expect them, Andrea, to have a recommendation for the next meeting. I'm looking at the person who does the oversight there. All right, B is on the testing and evaluation systems. There's a couple things going on at the state level I wanted you to be aware of, and they're going to impact us. What I enclosed in your packet was something I sat on a conference call on with the state, which is what they call a flexibility waiver request amendment. Now, this is a waiver to a waiver. The state had to get a waiver for No Child Left Behind and submitted this voluminous document that resulted in the state adopting the Common Core, the state adopting these teacher and evaluation, new teacher and administrator evaluation systems, and a whole host of other things. So that waiver went in, and as they've moved through this process, as the pilots have come out, as the pace of assessment development has ground to a halt at the state level, they've decided they needed to modify the waiver. So, one waiver that they've asked for is to give districts the option of giving the CMT and CAP this year, or to give the new Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium Common Core tests. That's separate. That's in there, sitting, percolating with the federal government. This waiver is related to that because the teacher and administrator evaluation systems rely on CMT and CAP data for, in some cases, for, say, a teacher who teaches a tested area, 22.5% of their evaluation. It's in the plan you all approved. So now what they're saying is, if a district wishes to, ends up taking and giving SBAC instead of CMT, the district should be allowed then to modify their evaluation systems to not include statewide testing, since this is going to be a pilot year. They're not sure of the reliability and the stability of the test. They don't know when it's going to come back, and so on and so forth. So that's what this is about, along with a couple other things that are in here, one of which is to announce to us the kind of monitoring they're going to do to make sure we're doing all this, if you saw that at the end of it. So, and that's not something that's automatic at the federal level. So this is hanging in the air on several fronts. We have not yet received any paperwork from the state about the process for making these decisions, about who will make the decision, what the timing will be, and so forth. And so there's this limbo period that we're in on several fronts. So it's not just a matter of CMT versus SBAC, it's CMT versus SBAC, and what does that mean in our teacher and administrator evaluation plans for the year? So that's what this is all about. It's all up in the air. As information comes out, I'll let you know, and I expect that, I don't know for sure because of course they've told us one thing and done another before. I expect that if we're going to modify the teacher evaluation system or administrator evaluation system this year based on a decision, that would eventually have to come back to you because that was the plan you originally approved. But stay tuned. It's not going to be happening for the October meeting, so it's, I just don't see it happening at this point, but stay tuned. That's what that's all about. And my last update is just after the board had voted to go with an outsourced food service program. We've been doing a lot of research on this, and I want to sort of bring you up to speed on where we are. One thing is that, and Doreen Monsell is spearheading this, any RFP that goes out on this function has to be approved by the state, and they have a whole department that does this, and so they will ensure that all of the state regulations on healthy food, all the federal guidelines on healthy food are included in the RFP. So there's no way that you can even put out an RFP that doesn't do at least as much as what we're doing right now in the school system. And of course, it has to pass muster with the town's procurement officer, Twig Holland. So we have to get both of those things together. Doreen has met with a representative from the FLIP community and determined that they can put some of the procurement specifications that we've been using for healthy food right into the RFP, so that we expect to accelerate and enhance the quality of the food in the district moving forward. And the vendors are chosen on their ability to deliver the food service program we want. This is not a bid for paper clips, where all paper clips are the same and low bid generally wins. This is more like hiring an architect or a professional service, where certainly the financial arrangements can be part of it, but the overall criteria and weighting of it is much more comprehensive than that. So we're moving ahead with it, but it is going to take a little time. I think it's going to be a little bit of time before the RFP is out on the street, then it's going to take good 60 days while that's out there. There's a whole review process that the state has us go through internally and with them. So there's all kinds of safeguards in this thing. So we're marching through that process, but I see this as accelerating our efforts towards improving quality of the food. It's in no way would we allow it to regress. So those are my 3 items.
Any questions of the superintendent on those 3 items? Mrs. Brand?
Yes, through the chair to Dr. Title, do we have any plans, or what we can do as a backup plan for district assessments? I know we have blue ribbon, but I don't think that helps the upper grades in all the different subject areas.
We're working through that right now. It really depends on the grade level and the subject
Right.
area. The biggest challenge in teacher evaluation are the non-tested grades and subjects.
Right.
And in some cases, where we use some district assessment measures right now, but part of our work, a large part of our work, the curriculum leaders are really spearheading, is to develop, with the teachers, developing better performance assessments that are tied to our curriculum and to the new testing regime. So a lot of this work that we're going to be doing, this is going to be rolled out over several years. This is not something that, oh, we have all the assessments, we can get them, we can just put them in place. Yeah, I mean, for example, blue ribbon and math will still work, but that helps you with math and only with certain grades. But in terms of, what can you use in, family and consumer science or business, I mean, those are the discussions right now that the teachers, administrators, curriculum leaders are having to determine what measures are most appropriate, because teachers need to write their goals. You remember the whole presentation about the goal-setting process and the goal-writing process. One of the first things you have to do is determine what the appropriate measure is for that. And, in some cases, we've got it pretty well under control, and in other places, we see where we're going to have to do some significant assessment development over the next couple of years to line it up.
Yeah, my concern is that the state has a different timeline perhaps than we. The other question I had was relative to the RFP. Did it also include retaining our current employees?
Well, we have not written the RFP yet, but our intent is to include that in the RFP.
Thank you.
Any other questions of the superintendent on any of the 3 items mentioned? I did take note that a letter was sent to the food service employees kind of outlining the rationale of the board a couple of days after we made the vote. It sounds as though, and you gave a range as to when this transition might take place, but it sounds from your description, especially when you're saying it's going to end up in the state offices for a while, that this is likely to be toward the back end of that range rather than the front end?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Okay, if no other questions, on to old business. Are you prepared to substitute for Mrs. Connelly a second night?
I guess.
This is our second reading. Mrs. Connelly has her own as a teacher back-to-school night in Greenwich. She thought she might get up here from Greenwich in a back-to-school night by 8:30, but then again, when she had her surgery, she thought she'd be up and running around in 2 days, too, so we will proceed. I'm only saying this to give Mr. Fattabine a few moments to, but it's inclusion number 4, and this is the second reading, so let me get the motion on the floor. The recommended motion is that the Board of Education approve Policy 6200, Instruction-Curriculum. Do I have a motion, Mrs. Iacona? Seconded by Mrs. Gerber. Mr. Fattabine.
All right, basically, this is this motion would amend Policy 6200, in essence, to conform to a settlement agreement that was reached between the state, the Board of Education, and complainants in a complaint that was brought to the State Board of Education. Basically, what it is adopting the administrative regulations and then indicating that the administrative regulations will not be revised without prior approval of the board, which was in essence the agreement. So really, it just places or puts in conformance this policy now with that agreement.
And to remind the board, as I did last meeting, the administrative regulations, one might say, have technically been approved by this board when it approved the settlement agreement, because these were attached to it, but our agreement was that we would then make them part of policy, and that's what this action is done tonight. Any questions from the board on this matter? Being a voting item, we will go to the public on the motion to approve Policy 6200. Any comments from the public? Seeing nobody rising, back to the board for vote. All in favor of Policy 6200, raise your hands. And it is a unanimous vote of the 6 members who are present. New business. None on the agenda. Public comments and petitions of a general nature, not including items that are on the agenda. Any members of the public wish to address the board on other matters? Just please state your name and address.
Liz Moyes, 1120 South Pine Creek Road. I would like to comment on the Woodward and Kern April probability report regarding PCBs. First, as a parent at Mill Hill who was vocal regarding the PCB issue, there was very little transparency in terms of the consultants testing at our school. The consultant and staff came into the school, tested, and left without any contact with our PTA. When I reviewed the report, it appeared as though only one classroom was tested. And although our entryway looks just like Osborne Hill's entryway, and Osborne Hill's entryway had a threshold of PCB contaminant which exceeded the EPA threshold, there was no testing done due to the ceiling on the floor. And instead, the report highlights how at Osborne Hill there could have been cross-contamination causing that high threshold for PCB. However, I guess I thought when we hired a consultant, they would review the paperwork, review our records to see if we use the same materials in Osborne Hill as we used in Mill Hill, and that wasn't done. Additionally, given the nature of the testing and that particular site, it seems to me, that would have been perfect for air testing. And I'm very happy that somebody asked about air testing, because it seems to me like it was a foregone conclusion that that was never going to happen, because it might actually find a higher level of PCBs. In terms of that, I just would like to also note, with the back and forth that went here, that caulking is friable. Every time you close a door and open a window, you're using friction, and that caulk can get into the air, just like asbestos. And when we know that we have a problem in one school, it's not that surprising that we might have a problem in another. And to test directly would have been the preferred choice.
We have, I don't know whether you realize, we have a 2-minute time limit, and your time is up. Did
Can I
you
just
you
make
finished?
one more sentence?
One more sentence.
I just wanted to remind the board that the EPA's threshold level for PCBs may seem conservative. However, it is also taking into consideration that we all have background levels of PCB exposure and other exposures, and so it may not be as conservative as it seems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please state your name and address.
Sure. Tricia Donovan, 164 Tainer Drive. I was just wondering if the board could ask for an update on Infinite Campus, which everyone is referring to as Infinite Disappointment. It seems that there are a lot of problems with the system. It's not working. Students are having trouble logging on, and I was wondering if we could get an open discussion on that.
Thank you very much. Please state your name and address.
Nancy Haberly, Duck Farm Road. Oh, I do this every time. Sorry. I had sent an email regarding dismissal times for the elementary schools to a few of the board members. And what's happening is some schools are dismissing at 3:20 and 3:25. I looked up dismissal time per, the guide and per the website, and it's 3:30. So I'm wondering what the dismissal time, the official dismissal time is of elementary schools, because I feel that over the buildup over the course of the year, we're going to be losing instructional time. If kids are dismissed at 3:20, they're going to be losing 30 hours of instructional time per year. If they're dismissed at 3:25, it's 15 hours a year. And I understand, with walkers and bussers, I'm a Riverfield parent with one of my children, and we had always done 3:25 for walkers and 3:30 for bussers over the past 5 years that I've been there. But now we're pushing back to 3:20, and I'm wondering, this might be a common practice in other schools, I'm not sure, and it could be due to traffic flow or different populations of walkers versus bussers, but it's inequitable. I mean, if we're having different times that kids are being let out of school, the board policy needs to be followed. So I would really like some investigation on that and what's going on with that. And if Riverfield keeps pushing this and other schools keep pushing this, are we going to be in compliance with the state? Is this going to become an issue at the end of the year? And I understand we do 182 days versus 180, but you're going to end up pushing this. And, next year is going to be 315. It's a big thing. Also, I just wanted to, yes.
You're at your 2 minutes.
Can I say positive things if I'm going to go over? Because I have something very nice to say about the RLMS team.
2 sentences, because I do have to have
Okay.
the same standard for everybody.
That's fine.
Regardless.
I just wanted to express my gratitude and thanks to my son's team at RLMS, because they are absolutely awesome. He's a 6th grader going in this year, and they are clear, concise, respectful to me, to him. It's been so far so good, and I'm extremely pleased. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Please state your name and address.
Betty Ann O'Shaughnessy, Queens Grant Road. Budget season starts soon. I ask that you consider the following. Put student achievement and development first. Look for places where we are spending out of proportion to the benefit. Consider eliminating pay for play, especially when it is focused on so few students. If it is considered necessary, please consider a smaller charge to all students in extracurricular with a waiver to ensure no student is excluded for financial reasons. Number 2, ensure policies and procedures are in place so the board members sworn in as agents of the state to uphold the laws can ascertain that the superintendent has informed them of everything needed to be done to comply with state law. For instance, transparency and compliance will reduce the board's expenditures on legal fees. One area for improvement is the approval of textbooks or any materials used in lieu of a textbook. I'm aware of handwritten math materials going home, and there is no textbook apparently. Ensure money is spent wisely. For instance, Infinite Campus has not been working properly, creating a communication debacle. Let's make sure purchases fit the intended purpose and we can fund sufficient staff to implement properly. Ensure all transfers of funds are authorized by the board in advance. For instance, a payment from operating on behalf of, for instance, food service is a transfer. It requires board authorization. And please include parents and the public in a transparent process. In recent years, programs have been authorized or reduced with no presentation of what that means to the education of Fairfield's children. That is not good for the quality of our education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see no one else standing, so no other comments. We do have one last one. Please state your name and address.
Sure. Christina Marson, North Cedar Road, Fairfield. Tonight I'm approaching the board to address two different security issues. The first one, Infinite Campus or Infinite Disappointment. While there may be a few benefits, I am primarily interested into who and when decided my children's pictures should be put up on a website that we don't know how many people have access, what security could be. My children aren't allowed on Facebook. I certainly don't appreciate that. We don't know how capable it is to be hacked into. And I'd also like to know how many screens are visible to different people. Everybody seems to have a different screen whenever I'm calling in, that there's an administrator screen, an IT screen, a principal screen, and it's various information. So I'd like to have further understanding to that. Secondly, I'd also appreciate how a plan has been put into place for security issues at the high school level. My children have been fortunate enough to be a part of the elementary and middle school level that has become secure, but unfortunately the high school level, the children mill about as I can go walking in, and the dissemination of information for our children has suddenly become more important than how the safety of our children should be number one. So in a recent comment from the principal, who I can't seem to get to return my calls. So I would appreciate hearing from the board of how we could move forward in that direction. I understand the police department has been working with 17 different facilities, and that has been ongoing for well over 9 months since Sandy Hook. But our children are back in school, and I would like to see some plans as to how we are moving forward to effectively communicate to parents as well as children how to stop any sort of violence in the school place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other people? For those who may be new to attending board members' meetings, public comment is so that the board can be made aware of concerns. If you don't see us responding to each speaker, it's because that is not our practice, but to take public comment so that we're aware of issues that are of concern. Back to the board for any open board comment. Mr. Liu.
Thank you. I have a couple of things I want to talk about. The first one is just sort of off the cuff, since you brought it up, Mr. Chairman, which is, I'm not suggesting that we have an outcome, but if people are going to bring up suggestions and we're not really going to answer them here, are we going to answer them at some place in time? Are we going to post them? Are we going to just, I know sometimes the questions don't always rub well with any of us or the administration, or sometimes we do like them, but the fact of the matter is there are questions, and I'm wondering how are we going to answer them? We can answer them with, no, we don't agree, or we do agree, but it's something I think we really need to sort of work out. My next point was about security, because I did see the emails, and I do, as a parent, I do think it's really important. I know we've been spoken to as a board in executive session that we want to be very pragmatic about not necessarily showing everything that we're doing security-wise so that the people who would possibly harm somebody at the school would have access to that. So I'm not asking about cameras or locks or things like that, but I do think protocols. And I think what's important is that if the students are going to be given protocols about how to act in an emergency situation, then the parents need to know as well, so that when that emergency situation does, God forbid, happen, we're all working together, and the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. And I think one of the speakers brings up the public speakers brings up a really good point, is that I think we do need to have that now. If we are talking to the students, then we can tell the parents as well what's going on. My third thing is something that you put that was put into our Friday packet, which is about the interactive math support that was the outcome of the settlement with the state. Is this being put out to all the parents so that they know that it exists? How is this being? It is. Okay. Is there like a bulletin, or has it gone out yet? Because I haven't. It has. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mrs. Brand.
Yeah, several things. Dr. Title and I both were at the Bethel Sukkot luncheon this afternoon, which was absolutely lovely. I have asked before, but I will reiterate the importance, I think, of going through the strategic school profile. I believe we have the 2011-2012, but what we have posted on the website is 2010-2011. I think it's important for us to take a look at that in looking at any kind of particular trends, so that we can look and see where we think there is a need to actually put our money. I looked at, because I too was aware of the issue with the dismissal, and I looked up, we do have information on dismissal times. We have the requirements for the number of hours, but what I'm wondering if the policy committee would work with administration in terms of regs, so that whatever we have going on in the district was consistent. Relative to security, I had something else that I spoke to Dr. Title about earlier, because sometimes I think we provide information that, quite frankly, may not be necessary to the public, and it may behoove us to just keep to ourselves. In addition to that, with that same thinking, we have for years posted bus routes in the newspaper. I would suggest that we no longer do that. I think we can adequately address the information through school sites, through registration, without posting it, because I think with a lot of the issues that we know we've had in town, and there's no need. No one needs to know that Sally's going to be at the bus stop down the street at a particular time. That's not public information. So I would ask that in the future that we actually not put it in print. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the board? Hearing no comments, a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Iacono, second. Mrs. Gerber, all in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Unanimous. The motion, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. We got right on time.
I tried.
It's like a record.
Thursday night or Friday? What do you normally do? Friday morning. Friday morning, yeah. I normally go out Thursday night because
Because you have a lot of time on your hands.
I have time on my hands, and I'm a night person, so I prefer driving at night, not waking up early in the morning and getting on the road.
Yeah, but at night it's more difficult driving typically. It's darker.
lights in front of you. Just not too close.
Not too close. Did you haven't by heard anyone else that might be going for an award?
No,